Hello. Okay, I have been working on this for 2 days. It's actually a very short little scene, but I used to just write, just da-da-da-da, as it was just coming out of me, and I would write chapters upon whatever, just like vomiting words, okay? And then I found it was a really huge job to go back through a bunch of, pages of unnecessary whatever and try to figure out, basically tighten it up, get rid of the unnecessary stuff, find what I wanted in all that. I found through the course of writing that I think of writing as when you have a sculpture, you have something that's really crude, made out of just, it's a crude shape made of clay, right? Maybe the general idea of what you want, but it's just a shape, and then you take the time to refine it until it is what you want, until it becomes the form that you want. That's what I kind of throughout the course of trying to write my first book. I wrote just the more pages the better. That was my thought. I found that by sculpting, as it were, just going through the paragraphs over and over and just kind of tweaking them and reading them out loud, see how they flow, tweak them some more until they are at what I consider to be to the quality that I want. I would do that with each paragraph, and then the next paragraph I would make sure it flows with the one prior, and so on and so on and so on until the entire chapter is that way. I found that by doing that, when I go back later and read it, yes, I'm still going to find things that needs to be fixed and refined, but the damage control, the repair that the chapter requires when I go back later to read it, I find is so much less because I put more time into what is there in the first place. So anyway, this is a rough draft more or less because, like I said yesterday, this chapter was just a scene that I had just put there, like, okay, do something with this, Diane, and then I never went back. So what I did was take that little battle scene, which a lot of it had to be cut because, going back now and looking at it, there's a conversation in the middle of the battle, okay? There's a conversation, like that's actually going to happen in real life, a conversation. So that was a lot of the battle scene. So I got rid of the conversation. I changed it quite a bit. So plus I added the lead into stuff that wasn't there before, which I read a little bit yesterday in my, oh my gosh, I haven't lost it video. Yeah, so I have the lead in to the battle, and I'm hoping this reads like a proper scene now. This is chapter 6 in its present form. And now I'm going to read it. Song of Mornius, chapter 6. Viewed from a distance, the town Meredith glittered like black steel links laid out before a glistening crystal pendant. The pendant, the temple of the seeker elves, towered above the modest homes and shops of the little town, outshone even the jagged peaks of the majestic mountains beyond it. Galen sighed as he braced himself against his staff, against wind buffeting him where he stood upon a hill more than a league away. Just a few scant hours ago he had been inside that temple, walking barefoot with Everov, the elf, along its pristine halls, oblivious completely of the peril tightening its jaws around Meredith. The sudden appearance of Tarek on his plunging black horse below the steps of the temple, then the wild, frenzied ride into the hills, had shocked from Galen any lingering benefits he'd gained from the temple's quiet tranquility. "We ride to battle," Tarek had shouted, as he reached down a hand to help Galen up behind the saddle. Together they had ridden hunched over the racing horse, while above their heads, wheeling in the sky, two-winged Wheelerman scouts screeched and dove to claw at them, their faces and shapes human, but not. At least 20 men from Meredith had joined Tarek's small army, or so it had seemed to Galen as Tarak threaded his lathered horse Ebony between their shouting ranks. Bonfires had been lit within the hollow between two adjacent foothills. Wheelermen loathed fire, Tarak had explained to Galen. The fierce golden light was meant to draw like moths to flame the enemy from the town and into what Tarak hoped would be a trap, one that would allow his men higher up on the hills to rush down upon the magic-warped humans and attack. From the town, Galen heard a bell ringing. Meredith's streets were deserted now, its fearful people huddled in their homes. The crystalline gem atop Mornius flared bright blue beside him. A stranger's voice entered his head, wove itself vaguely among his own thoughts. Galen, I am with you. Galen raised his hand and rubbed at his eyes. Pressure mounted at his temples. He felt the sickness roil in his gut that often assailed him at these times when the voice touched him from the staff. He shrugged his blue cloak forward over his arms and pressed its warm folds against his aching chest. Before him the sun began settling itself in pillows of blazing pinks and reds behind the black silhouette of the mountains. The enemy waited in the distant trees between the town and its fields, waited for the cloak of darkness, and now here it obligingly came, shadows of early twilight marching relentlessly across the hilly terrain. This battle would be different, Galen thought, his hands tingling with dread. This time, Tarak wanted Mornius to kill. As the last streaks of daylight faded on the horizon, winged Wheelermen exploded like a great flock of birds from the trees behind the town. At once they arrowed in on the raging bonfires illuminating the hollow, flinging down fistfuls of snow or frozen dirt in mindless effort to quell the flames. Now, Tarak shouted the word from Ebony's back, his rearing stallion pawing the air high above the cluster of his men. The warriors surged down the hills in response, some pausing between steps to launch arrows or spears at the winged, man-shaped bodies overhead, while the rest clashed headlong into the oncoming wave of flightless creatures swarming up at them from all sides. Galen shook his head to clear his vision. Since the recent touch of his staff, the caress of words across his mind, he felt distanced from the world, queasy in his stomach, his head throbbing with pain. He could not remember seeing where the flightless Wheelermen had come from. Had they risen up from beneath the ground, or had the ones with wings carried them on their backs, dropping them to the ground and to battle as they flew? Galen fought to collect his thoughts as he huddled behind the backs of men battling to protect him. Tendrils of fog benumbed his throat, paralyzed his vocal cords. All at once the mist recoiled. Hands were slapping at his face, gripping his shoulders. Galen, now! Blinking hard to focus, Galen raised his head, groaning at the pain in his skull. All around him warriors battled, their flailing swords spattering blood. Tarak Florin's eyes were wild. He had clambered from his horse to seize Galen's shoulders. Galen winced as the larger man's hands pressed muscle to bone. The pain of it brought vivid memories of Chef Laval and years of abuse. With a sharp cry, Galen struggled to break free. "Do not touch him!" The booming voice came from his throat, but was not his own. A blinding flash erupted from Mornius to lash at Tarak, sending the older man reeling backward. The brief explosion from the staff dissolved then into an icy shimmering radiance, green and blue tongues of it that rippled down Galen's arms, dripping like melted steel from his palms. Galen fought to breathe, to see his friend's face through the glare of Mornius's gem. "I'm sorry," Galen cried to the man who was his friend. "I don't know what I did. I don't—" Tarak wheeled to parry a blow aimed for his head. He grunted with effort to throw the creature back. As it stumbled, Galen caught a terrifying glimpse of the creature's face, a jagged tooth smile, and eyes staring out past what appeared to be melted skin. The open mouth was a twisted grimace of rotted teeth and blood, the fierce eyes blazing with a red savage light. It was in pain, Galen realized, a creature tortured as he had been. He staggered as a man crashed into him from behind. All around him the creatures fought with mindless ferocity. He had seen them from afar, but never this close. Beside his head, Mornius's gem flared in response. An overwhelming pity filled Galen. From that distant place it seemed he dwelled, he heard a quiet weeping. "Graken's teeth," came Tarek's voice. "Virgen, stop!" An explosion shot skyward from the heart of the forest. A lake of liquid fire spread itself out, its corrupted magic melting the trees. In a state of half-awareness, Galen saw shapes behind the flaming branches, the black silhouettes of Malian's warped humans screaming, running. "More are coming," Tarek shouted. "Their leader drives them with fear. Brace yourselves! Roth, get those fires stoked! Galen, Galen held Mornius close, the staff's power swarming like ants between his fingers. "They suffer." The weeping voice came again through his head like a wandering stranger. "They suffer." "Tarek!" Galen skidded after his friend, his hands clenching his staff that in brutal stages became harder to hold. Warriors pounded down the hill toward the fires, slashing at bodies, Wheelermen leaping or diving to rip them apart. Under the chill blue light from Mornius's stone, Galen saw men covered with blood, fighters dealing out blows even as the enemy smote them. Galen collapsed to his knees, clutching his staff to his chest. Everything mattered. Nothing mattered. Nothing, save that Tarek was gone. Blades clanged above his head. His guard, Dren Avram, grunted with effort, battled at his side to protect him. Weapons hammered and clashed, slaying warriors he knew, men like Tarek who wanted him fighting, who needed his staff to kill. "They suffer," came the voice again, and this time Galen screamed at the force of it in his head. The battle faded and blurred. Body trembling, Galen surged upright. He couldn't see, couldn't focus. Anger swelled in his chest, cut crimson lines across his sight. In his grasp, his staff erupted, bolts of fire leaping skyward, crackling down the hill. Around him, scores of the enemy tumbled back. Screaming, they hit the ground, their bodies writhing and twisting beneath the fiery river lancing across the hill, flowing in pulse after shimmering pulse from one lone human they hadn't seen before. "Yes!" Dren shouted by his head. "Laval, behind you!" Galen wheeled, and again power surged. A concussion shocked the air as more of the enemy fell, their twisted shapes curling, melting beneath flames grown hot with fury. Dazed, Galen stumbled toward them, the staff in his hands, raging beyond his control. A midnight shape bore down on him. He clambered to meet it, smacked into a horse's sweaty shoulder. Rearing, the beast pawed the sky. "Galen!" He blinked at the voice, stared up at a face he hardly knew, Tarek's features spattered with blood. Shaking his head, Galen peered down through the darkness at what his staff had done. "This isn't real," he thought. "This can't be real." Mornius cooled and shivered in his grasp. Above his head its skystone waned. Tarek's hand caught him above his elbow, dragged him up behind the saddle. Gripping the cantle, shoving his upper thighs against it, Galen swayed as Tarek lunged sideways. He felt the strength of Tarek's sword thrust through the stretch of the saddle, witnessed the white-faced agony of the charging Wheelerman's death. "Hang on!" Tarek, jerking his blade free, rain-slapped his mount up the hill. Huddled behind the saddle, Galen curled his fingers under Tarek's wide belt. Fighters pressed close, their weapons flailing. Galen flinched, then screamed when a slashing blade ripped his thigh. "Almost through!" Tarek's voice was hoarse from shouting. He wheeled Ebony around and snagged one of his men. Holding out with a mailed fist to the man's collar, he hauled the stricken warrior off his feet and pulled him from the fray. Galen caught a glimpse of stillness, a clean patch of snow atop the hill. Numb with shock, he slid to the ground as Tarek halted his horse. "I don't understand." Galen bent over his slashed leg. With icy fingers he examined his cut through the torn leather, a narrow gash as long as his hand. "He was trying to help them, Tarek. Why would Mornius kill?" Tarek loosed his grip on his injured man, then leapt from the saddle to crouch beside him. Turning, he raised his voice above the clamor of the battle below. "Galen, hurry! Grenner needs you!" Forgetting his confusion, Galen knelt opposite Tarek and peeled back Grenner's mail. Then he nodded, sensing as Tarek retreated to remount his horse. Closing his eyes, Galen lifted Mornius above Gregor. "He suffers," came the voice in his head. Galen frowned and gritted his teeth. During the battle he had lost his focus, his control over his staff. Yet now, kneeling beside Grenner, clarity returned. "This is what I want," he thought. Grenner seized his arms below his elbows and squeezed until Galen felt his hands go numb. Wincing, Galen lowered the staff, pressed its shaft against Grenner's broad chest. Power crackled beneath his palms, spilling in heatless fountains of blue from his fingers to the stricken warrior. Grenner thrashed with his legs, then loosed his hold. Hands throbbing with restored circulation, Galen rested Mornius in the grass beside the young man's head. With his fingers he probed through the darkness where he was sure Grenner's wound had been. The skin was hale and whole. With a grunt, Grenner lurched to his feet, his big hands fumbling at his belt. Quickly he tucked in his jerkin, tugged to center his breastplate. "Don't go!" Galen dragged himself erect. Through a wave of fatigue, he reached to stop him. "You've lost too much blood." Grenner knocked aside his hand. "My thanks, staff wielder." The young man's voice rang boldly across the hill. Galen opened his mouth to protest, but Grenner was already striding down the flame-lit hill into battle, his sword bright with moonlight. Dazed and shivering, Galen bent to retrieve his staff. Then he limped after Grenner. Before him the forest glowed yellow, its corona of fire flickering orange above the trees. Galen stumbled as close as he dared, his free hand shielding his stinging eyes as he stared down through fire and billowing smoke. The surviving Wheelermen huddled trapped, caught between the bonfires in a closing ring of steel. Rigid with terror, the flightless, warped humans ignored their winged counterparts, flinching away whenever one dove from the sky to try to save them. Eyes closed, Galen strained to focus on the insides of his lids, on the echoes of fire blazing on across his vision. As if from a distance he heard the Wheelermen's anguished screams. Unwittingly he saw what the presence in his staff beheld without human eyes, the warped creature's brutal deaths. Tarek raised a hand and waved his army to him. His warriors who remained obeyed at once, dragging those men who were injured along with them. Trembling, Galen leaned on Mornius and watched. The cries of the wounded caught hold of him, compelling him down toward Tarek and his men. The carnage strewn across the hills. The world went spinning on and on as he fought to stay upright. Then he raised his staff. Tarek lifted a fist in answer, shouting encouragement above the triumph of his men. Slowly Galen lowered Mornius. He fell to his knees, the staff's bottomwood shaft pressed to his forehead. Teeth clenched in effort, his every muscle quivering, Galen strained and rocked against the wood. With his mind he found the voice, the wounded presence still weeping. This time he welcomed, expected its touch, accepted Mornius's power and held it, hoarded it, let it gather itself like a fist clenching inside his chest. It burst from the staff in rhythm with his stumbling heart, pulse after pulse veining in rivulets across the hill, healing whatever hurts it found, melting into vapor what little remained of the snow. Gripping his staff, Galen sagged forward as finally the gem quieted above his whitened knuckles. He closed his eyes to echoes of flame chasing each other behind his lids. Heedless of the bloody trampled grass, he sank down slowly onto his side, drew his staff to his chest, and followed its ebbing flashes into non-violent night.